Why the luxury market's fate rests in Chinese wallets. Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. Western media has focused on the Chinese government's austerity measures, particularly how it's clamping down on gifting and the negative impact that's having on luxury sales in China, particularly products like high-end alcohol and accessories. As a result, many experts in Chinese luxury sector now doubt the strength of Chinese consumption as the key driver for luxury worldwide, but not everyone falls into that camp. Our guest today on Thoughtful is Erwan Rambourg, Managing Director and Global Co-Head of Consumer and Retail Global Research at HSBC, based in Hong Kong. He's also the author of The Bling Dynasty, which illustrates how doubts about Chinese consumption are ill-founded and why Chinese luxury demand is on the cusp of becoming dominant. And he's in our studio today to talk about his latest book. Erwan, thanks for joining us today. Your new book runs counter to the conventional wisdom that actually luxury is overdependent on Chinese consumers these days. In fact, you argue that China will continue to dominate global luxury sales. Why do you believe that?
Well, I think I got the idea of the book at the beginning of the anti-graft, anti-corruption campaign. So that started late 2012. And at the time you had a lot of people in the media, a lot of brand managers basically saying, Chinese sales will be impaired, but don't worry because the future is about the Indonesians, the Brazilians, the Nigerians, etc. And so the goal of this book is to say that that's wrong. Actually, the future Chinese are not Indonesian, Brazilian, Nigerian, but they're just more Chinese, other Chinese. And so the idea is, if you look at the sales in luxury in aggregate right now, about 35% of sales in luxury are to Chinese nationals. I argue over the 10-year view that will go from 35 to 50%. So basically the vast majority of sales will be with the Chinese.
And at the same time, these other developing nations, you don't see them matching the same type of growth rates?
I think the growth rates with Indonesian, Brazilian, Nigerian and more should be actually quite high. The thing is you're looking at a very low base. For the time being, luxury has been initially dominated by European consumers and then Japanese consumers. The reality is there's no growth with the Europeans anymore, there's no growth with the Japanese, linked to the fact that these consumers have been exposed for quite a long time and they've moved on basically from product accumulation to accumulation of experiences. And if you look at the up-and-coming nationalities, there's obviously the great help from middle-class expansion. What I would say is in China, the middle-class expansion is qualified, meaning you have a lot of new bodies, if I can say, new people who can actually afford these goods.
And at the same time, you mentioned Europe, and a big part of that is travel. For Chinese consumers, they're actually spending in Europe when they go on these trips. Talk about the travel insights that you gathered while researching for the book.
Well, I would say it's about the Chinese, it's not about China. The vast majority of purchases by mainland Chinese nationals takes place abroad for a whole bunch of different reasons. I actually developed an acronym for travel to try to explain these different reasons in the book. The T is for time, so it might seem a bit counterintuitive, but you tend not to buy locally because if you're in Shanghai or in Hong Kong, you might have intense days, you might be a bit stressed out. You're not in the right frame of mind to buy these goods. When you have time, when you're traveling, you'll have a bit of time at the airport, you'll have a bit of time in between business meetings if it's a business trip in downtown areas, or if you're on vacation, you'll be in a better predisposition to buy these goods. The R is for regulation, so this idea that you're traveling because you can, because many administrations around the world, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Korea, in Japan, in the UK, etc., are opening up, meaning making it easier for Chinese nationals to go there. The A in travel is for affordability. So that's mostly what people have in mind, meaning it's cheaper to buy abroad than to buy at home for a whole series of taxation issues, whether it's VAT, import duties, the consumption tax, etc. V in travel is for validation. Validation meaning a lot of luxury purchases are about basically fitting in and telling stories. So if you're buying a Burberry trench coat in London, or if you're buying a Tiffany ring in New York and you go back to China, you have a great story to tell. That product you can technically buy it in Shanghai and you'll have a story to tell, but that'll be a much shorter story, if I can say. The E in travel is for experience. It's this idea, probably an illusion rather than a reality, that you'll get a better experience in the stores if you're buying abroad rather than at home. And lastly, the L initial is for legitimacy. So if you're purchasing luxury goods in Shanghai or Beijing, you never have a doubt on where the product comes from. But you know, there are still a lot of cases of fake Apple stores, fake Armani stores, fake Victoria's Secret stores in China. And there's always a lingering doubt if you're from a smaller tier city in China, is this legit? Is this the real brand?
Well, speaking of the store experience within China, and I actually think one of the factors is the experience, because if you compare how Chinese consumers are treated almost like royalty in certain European cities when they step into the luxury brand stores and how they're treated here, I think there is a distinction. But more importantly, the luxury brands within China have started to pull back in terms of their store expansion and their openings. Do you believe that they were too aggressive when they started to open, stores in every city, second, third, and fourth tier cities?
I think you had a lot of sort of uber enthusiasm because this was the next growth market. And so probably some brands got a bit ahead of themselves. To be fair, I don't think there's been overexpansion to the extent that there's a lot of showrooming going on. It's actually quite important to have a good representation in mainland China, even if the majority of your sales takes place with the Chinese outside of mainland China frontiers, because that's your first experience with the brand. So, you take a brand like Miu Miu, for example, which is part of the Prada group. If the first time you see a Miu Miu store is in London or Milan or Tokyo, for example, you'll just go past the store because you've never seen it before. But if you live in China and you've seen a phenomenal Miu Miu flagship, a lot of commentators have been talking about cathedrals rather than stores, so very impressive setups. Then the first experience with that brand will have been phenomenal. You'll have a good image of that brand, and likelihood is, there's not a lot of traffic in Chinese-based luxury stores, so you'll have actually staff willing and able to show you around. When you then will go to Milan, to Tokyo, to New York, you will recognize Miu Miu, and you might have interest to actually. So I think it's important, this showrooming element, which is you accept to invest in China to recoup that investment outside of China with the Chinese. And then there's also potentially regulation changes. If taxation for some reason comes down, there's a whole tax reform that's been thought over by the Chinese administration. This could actually lower the price gaps between China and what's happening abroad, and it might be a way of retaining consumption here in China. And if that's the case, you'll be happy to have that footprint, actually.
Well, on that note, interestingly, Chanel was a great example of doing that recently, and in Shanghai there were record numbers of sales on the days that they did that. Does this change your view significantly in terms of how you project spending proportionately outside of China, within China? There are a lot of people who say that sort of testing was very successful and seemed to whet the appetites of both the brands but also the government, who are trying to encourage more domestic spending. So do you see that as a very likely change in regulation?
I think so, absolutely. I think the luxury brands are trying to harmonize prices, not because it's a strategy at all, just because it's an obligation. I mean, if you go back to the theme of travel, or if you look at blogs or forums, etc., the level of information is now very high. I think many luxury managers have been complacent for too long, thinking that because you're selling to Asian consumers, you can charge more. There's no reason for it. And again, you're not selling to a Chinese person in China, you're not selling to a Frenchman in Paris, you're not selling to a New Yorker in New York, you're selling to a global traveler. And that global traveler knows what she or he should be paying. So I think the Chanel move is actually quite telling. Chanel did a dramatic move. They actually lowered price points by 20% in both Hong Kong and mainland China. They actually increased at the same time by 20% in the Eurozone. I think what they did, no one will be able to do to the same magnitude. Chanel can do it because they're Chanel. Chanel is very high-end. They're catering to a more affluent consumer, probably less price-sensitive consumer. And beyond that, it's not a listed company. They properly think 20 years out, and they do what's right for the brand equity. If you look at what other brands are doing right now, they are lowering prices in Hong Kong and in mainland China. They're increasing prices in the Eurozone. They're increasing prices in Japan, but it's tweaks. It's not 20%. Price harmonization will happen eventually, but what Chanel did in one day, the industry will do in maybe 2 or 3 years.
Now, there are some views that compare China and their stage in the consumer cycle with Japan in the 80s and 90s, when Japanese consumers were driving global luxury. Obviously, you've touched on the fact that China has a huge base, and so therefore a lot of the comparisons might not match up there. But in terms of their mentality and the consumer's stage of evolution and their sophistication, do you see them becoming like the Japanese or becoming more American?
I would say if you represent luxury consumption in the shape of a pyramid, people at the top of the pyramid, Chinese consumers at the top of the pyramid, will become more similar to the Japanese, meaning they will be moving away from product accumulation towards experience accumulation. So they'll be obsessed about travel. They will have an interest to go to Michelin star restaurants. They'll have interest for accommodation, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the vast majority. I mean, the vast majority is still about fitting in, displaying social status, et cetera. There are quite interesting metrics for Hong Kong, for example. Mainlanders going to Hong Kong spend about 74% on shopping. That tells you that accommodation is irrelevant. That tells you that high-end restaurants are irrelevant. That 74% will have to go down eventually as they develop other interests, services, travel, spa, cosmetic surgery, going to discover new avenues, going to South Africa, going to the Maldives, and not just going to Hong Kong anymore, or not just going to Europe, where they might have been. But I would say the vast majority of growth is still in the capacity that brands have to recruit new Chinese consumers who will want to immediately display social status. So from that aspect of things, I would say Japanization, if I can call it that, has not arrived in a big way. I would say that indeed the Chinese are probably more similar to the Americans in their approach to consumption on premium goods. And what I mean by that is they're a lot more knowledgeable, again because they travel, again because they're all over blogs and forums, and they know what they should be paying. So in that sense, they're becoming more similar to the American approach of value for money. So for example, you have the emergence with Chinese consumption. If you think about handbags and accessories, for example, 10 years ago, most wealthy Chinese people knew about Gucci and Vuitton, 2, maybe 3 brands with Prada. Now they know maybe 20, 25 brands. In 5 years, they'll probably know 50, half of which we've never heard about. And the new up-and-coming brands mostly are on a value for money positioning. So whether it's lifestyle brands from the US, people like Michael Kors, Tory Burch, Kate Spade, etc., or Korean brands. There's an up-and-coming frenzy for Korean products in the premium space, not just in handbags and accessories, actually, also in cosmetics, sporting goods, etc. So there is a big threat of substitutes for parts of the luxury industry where Chinese consumers may want to invest more on their retirement, on education for their kids, on eating healthy food, and probably spend less on basically luxury products that they accumulate.
And when they do spend, they're going to look for brands that represent perhaps a more individual or a reflection of their personality and their taste rather than simply fitting in.
Yes, I mean that's actually also linked to this degree of how much traveled are you, how sophisticated are you, how wealthy are you? Is it the first time you're going to Paris, or is it the third time? If it's the first time and you're not that wealthy, you'll probably be obsessed about shopping, and you might end up eating in Chinese restaurants in Paris because you want to keep close to that comfort zone. If it's the third time you're going to Paris and you're wealthier, you might accept to go to a 5-star hotel instead of staying in the suburbs to pay cheaper prices. You might experiment with Michelin star restaurants. So yeah, I mean it's all about knowledge. It's all about projection. And I think the interesting thing about travel is wealthy Chinese individuals will actually want to relate to a cosmopolitan consumer, meaning I want to relate to the New Yorker, the Parisian, the person in Tokyo and Milan, rather than to emulate or be inspired by what other Chinese consumers are doing. So you're right, you're moving away from a sort of commonplace, common thought approach to trying to say something slightly different about myself. I don't want to go too far because I think it's quite important to remember that there are a lot of values, group values of fitting in. So I don't want to be a rebel, but yes, if I'm able with a brand that's not totally unknown to stand out slightly differently from peers, then I'll try to do that.
Erwan, thanks for being on Thoughtful. We look forward to having you back soon. That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Youku, Tudo, and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter and join our LinkedIn group. We'll see you again.